Civilized Society.
Welcome to the Silver Eye Society podcast. We are back with an episode that we are going into the depths of history for our discussion on. We're going to be using the Northman to talk about vengeance, revenge, and what role it does or does not play in our society today. The Northman, excellent movie by director Robert Eggers, never fails, never misses, always comes through with the fire. We love it. We stan him. This is a great movie, but it's also a really good movie for discussing a concept that doesn't exist much in our society, at least not in the form that it once did in the times like the time in the Northman, this pre-Christian civilization and culture. So let's jump into vengeance in this episode. We're going to discuss whether we're seeing a problem in our society because of the lack of language and a place for that desire for vengeance, or whether it's better to not have that concept in society. Let us discuss, let us debate, but let us begin with the word of the podcast.
Wergeld. That's the word of the podcast. Wergeld, a noun, a set sum of money as the value of a free man based on social rank and paid as compensation for his murder or injury in discharge of punishment or vengeance. Old English, vergeld. West Saxon, vergeld. From ver, W-E-R, man. See, virile.
Okay, we don't need all of this. We don't.
Learn words, please. Plus geld, payment or tribute. See,
That's
geld.
weird. Geld?
Yeah, like, think of a word that might sound like money. That sounds like geld.
Gold.
Change the E to an O. Oh, there we go.
I
All
thought
right.
gelding, like a horse.
You did, but that was incorrect.
Okay.
Now.
You got your vergeld hairstyle on display for this Nordic episode.
The man bun had to be brought down in order to get the Northman style for this very important episode about the concept of vengeance.
That's right.
We won't dwell on the word of the podcast anymore, except to say what we're dealing with in this film. And the reason this director is someone I will always respect is because he actually creates historical films correctly. I think his first film, The Witch, is misinterpreted because I actually think The Witch is the most Christian film made in 150 years. I don't know how long. But anyway, that's for another episode. What he does is he actually presents characters living out the values of their society in the historical time. Now, briefly, the reason that I selected this word for the word of the podcast, and the reason that I've allowed my Norman locks to be here on this episode. Norman. Do you know who the Normans are?
No.
Think about it. There's some more words. Northmen. The Normans were the Viking invaders of France, who then became the knights and rulers of France, who then, when William the Conqueror invaded Anglo-Saxon England, those were the Norman. The Norman. The word came from Northmen because they were Vikings that had invaded France before that. But we are off topic.
Wait, so people that are named Norman, are they named after the Normans? Like, not consciously, but is that where the...
I don't know. Probably. That would be my guess.
It's interesting. Okay.
But England, that's... Okay, well, that's too much. Too much history. More vengeance.
Yeah.
Listen. This is a different world. But what I want to eventually bring this back to towards the end of the episode is that what I'm wondering is if it's a world that we're going to enter back into. Now, why is this a different world in the Northman? Because central to the movie is the battle between vengeance or love. he picks vengeance. That's because that was actually a positive value in this time. And people have a hard time understanding that. That was what you were supposed to do, is to take vengeance upon your enemies. Those who have wronged you, that's what you're supposed to do. Because it's a pre-Christian world. Now, the Christian world tells us something different, right? Even in the Old Testament, it says, vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. In other words, vengeance is given over to the deity to dispense. And then in the New Testament, we very much get this idea.
Turn the other cheek, etc.
Sure. From Romans, repay no evil for evil. Have regard for good things in the sight of all men. That sounds nice. If it is possible, as much as depends on you, live peaceably with all men. Again, kind of nice. Beloved, do not avenge yourselves, but rather give place to wrath. For it is written, and then they quote the Old Testament, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. But there's a distinction here that's extraordinarily important to understand. The Christian worldview is that individuals should not take vengeance upon their enemies. That it's against God to do so. That is not the case in this film. And I think that it's actually this notion that bothered critics about this film more than some of the critique, which you can maybe talk about briefly, which was about race and about representation, and all that. And if you want to speak to that, but I actually think underlying it all was this concept because and then briefly I'll give this over to you, but this is key. If we move into a secular world, which we have, and to bring this to a thing that happened currently in the LA Times, there was an editorial about one of the Supreme Court justices with the abortion thing and everything. It said, I'm worried about us becoming less Christian country. And this guy who wrote the editorial was like, that's great, secularism, Christianity's dumb, I'm raising my children in a secular world. Okay, fine. Here's the thing, though. This is my speculation. What will be the place of vengeance if you take the Christianity away in a secular world? Because there's going to have to be a place for it. And I have some theories about where I think it will go and how it will play out. But my locks must rest. Continue.
Okay. Yeah, I agree that there is likely this unconscious offense taken by seeing a kind of glorification. This is what, fools see every movie as glorification. They don't understand that, someone can be a protagonist without necessarily meaning that this is a good choice. It is simply watching a story play out. And so you watch this story play out in the Northman where the protagonist chooses vengeance as though instead of love, instead of this Christian ideal, essentially, which is let go of the old way and come with me, have your family, live happily. And this is very interesting. It's kind of almost this more, it is a little more modern in that sense. Like I can see that you could look at the movie as that, as a split, it's like what this man that exists on the cusp of two traditions, the way of vengeance, and then this new Christian ideal of choosing love over vengeance. I
have to interrupt briefly, though you're doing a great job, but that is correct, but incorrect within the film because the woman who is saying choose your family is actually a pagan Slavic forest dweller. But I do understand
I don't think she
the
has
concept.
To be a Christian for it to be. I don't think she's overtly saying come be a Christian. That's not what I'm saying.
Sure, I know that.
But I think that's why, in some ways, people would have liked that part of, they would have enjoyed that playing out in the film, maybe. I think it's hard to sympathize with the protagonist's choice. I really had to stretch a little bit to understand the choice, to have this character choose vengeance and die for that. And I knew that I had to to look at it from this older perspective, because that's the only way that could make sense. And so anyway, to speak to the criticism of the movie, yeah, it's just a lot of, like the laptop class, like people, whatever, that still read the New York Times and the New Yorker and think that makes them cool and interesting, and saying shit about like, oh, it's the movie, where is the representation, or like, oh, it's toxic masculinity, which is just like, what do you want? What do you want? You want, like, should he have been disabled or something? Like, what are we going to do here? So I don't know. It's just people that cannot enjoy things and don't have a realistic understanding of the world. So all their criticisms sound ridiculous, because they are. But I think that it makes sense that actually there's two things that probably bother people about this film, which is, one, it's a story that is real. Like, it's actually deals with real things, as opposed to this kind of like fantasy world where everything is nice and everything just works out for everyone and whatever. And it's like this weird Disney film that everybody wants to live in. But I also think that it makes people uncomfortable to see these kind of more, I don't want to say traditional, but traditional in a way, forms of human relationships and society. I think it makes people really uncomfortable, because particularly a kind of modern Western person, they hate that this existed so much, and they have been taught to have this shame over this chapter in humanity, that they cannot decouple their moral judgments from the existence of the thing. There is no way for them to view that as having had its role in time and functioning for what it did. Like, those societies worked. They existed for a while. No,
It's not so
I
much
don't want to
whether they
live in
were.
them. But
I mean, Viking. So this is about Vikings, if no one figured that out yet. Before Christianity took over, though they know about Christianity, because when he takes great vengeance upon his enemies at the beginning, they actually think, oh, this is a Christian that did this, because they don't know anything about Christianity. They think it's the thing that people would do if they did violence or whatever. Vikings, to a degree, was an occupation more than a people, though the people were all centered around a geographic area, and so, they looked a certain way. But Viking really just means someone who's going out to take stuff from other people, basically.
But this isn't solely Viking culture. Like, this is also
it is.
Nordic, like, and is more broad, isn't it? Like, this kind of idea of, pre-Christian ideals.
Vikings are pre-Christians.
Yeah, but I'm saying it's not only specific to Vikings, no?
Yeah, that's what these motherfuckers are. They're Vikings, except for
I know
the
they're
woman.
Vikings. I'm saying that there are other people that lived in this kind of pre-Christian world where ideas like vengeance were used, but that weren't necessarily Vikings.
That aren't in the movie, you mean?
Yes, of course. Well, yeah. I'm talking about the world.
Well, I thought you meant the Slavic woman who was Slavic and not a Viking. Okay. Yes, but mainly Northern European. So this gets complicated. But so the Germans in Roman times, even before Christianity, the Romans were Southern Europeans with a Mediterranean culture, which wasn't the same as the Germanic culture, which was outside the Roman Empire.
The Goths. I just want to say.
And even farther north, these people who were living up in Norway and all that. So there certainly is, with the Romans, also a pre-Christian notion of triumph and defeating your enemies, and that being a positive thing. But that's why the word of the podcast I use is vergeld, because that's a very specific Germanic idea of that. Depending on your place in society, you're literally just worth a certain sum of money. And so if you harm that person, you pay for it. And you see this in the film also, where the guy gets mad and just starts killing his slaves. they're his to dispose with as he wants, right? He couldn't do that to someone who had a higher place in society. He could, but he would have to pay. So that is different than like the Greek and the Roman idea to some degree. But yes, they're both pre-Christian.
Yeah. And I bring that up because it's important to tie that in with the kind of like more political criticism of the film that we're talking about, where people just view it as like, oh, this is alt-right immediately because it doesn't espouse modern kind of Christian views, which is, I think, what you're touching on with this idea of, now we're this modern society and people are like, oh, it's great, let's be post-Christian. I want to raise my kids in a secular world. Okay, this is the age-old conundrum of, are you throwing out the baby with the bathwater? Are you so sure that everything that came from a Christian civilization is holding you back, and that there are not things that are actually supporting the society that you enjoy now? There's downsides to everything, but I think the idea of vengeance, if you're going to be so offended by watching a protagonist in a film during this Viking era pursue vengeance, if that's going to come off to you as this kind of like, oh, toxic masculinity, well, then perhaps you actually very much like a Christian society more than you realize. And so let's move this episode along to the main point, which is what happens if we remove from society the Christian ideal of abstaining from vengeance. Do you want to take that up?
Yeah. So, first off, briefly, the criticisms that some people had about the movie about it being toxic masculinity or whatever. And there was also a race thing because they were like, they're all white. And it's like, yeah, they're from fucking Norway, dummy. So I'm not even going to bother with that. Honestly, that whole debate at this point is just for retarded people. Yeah, I refuse to be a part of it. If you don't understand what history was, it's okay. You probably haven't ever read a book. Here's my thing. People think that it's funny because a lot of the secular humanists and people, atheists even, and modern moderate left-wing people, and even moderate conservative or right-wing people, they don't understand how much their worldview is the way it is because of Christianity. Like this, and that's what I think is really challenging about the movie, that I think probably got through on some level to people, but they couldn't verbalize it because they don't actually understand what the world was like. You said glorify something earlier. I can't remember what it was. Glory is glorious. Your whole idea of like the idea of glorifying something being bad does not make sense to pre-Christian people. They revel in glory and the destruction of their enemies. The idea of not thinking about that is Christian. It's a meek disposition and bringing glory to God as opposed to yourself. That's why I'm trying to get at the people that they think they're going to create the secular humanist world. All it really is lukewarm Christianity without actually believing in an afterlife. They don't understand that because they just don't. And God bless them all. Whatever. What I'm saying the danger is that's not going to work because the whole idea of actually believing in a God and the afterlife and all that stuff, and the vengeance part, by the way, you need to believe somebody up there is going to take vengeance if you do bad to some degree. If you remove all that and let's just say, let's all be nice to each other.
It makes no sense then. The idea
beyond
of abstaining.
It not making any sense.
No, I mean like the idea of abstaining from vengeance makes no sense if you don't believe in a strong reason for why it is good to abstain from vengeance. And it must go deeper than this, like, it's just the right thing. Like, that's not, it's different. The Christian ideal of that is that someone will take vengeance on your part, and it is wrong for you to do it. You can't do it. So that's a very compelling concept for why vengeance is not something you should take into your own hands. If you have this now population where you get these mixed, lukewarm messages where it's vengeance is wrong, but it's just wrong. You know, the courts would deal with things if it's a crime, or, you know, it's just not your right to go about and take vengeance. Those are not really compelling answers for someone that feels deeply aggrieved. And I want to expand that out, right? Because I use the example of, oh, well, the courts. Vengeance isn't only something that you feel the need to take in response to a specific crime against you. I mean, it can be much more broad and philosophical. The idea that you've been dealt a bad hand in life, the idea that your society is set up at your expense and that you're at the bottom of that society with no way to climb your way up. So those kind of scenarios would breed a desire for vengeance. And for that kind of situation, that desire for vengeance is not going to be quelled by it's wrong or the courts will handle it. This is a kind of deeper emotional desire to right oneself, to take, you know, justice for one's own life. And so I think that we're not even grappling with the complexity and the universality of a feeling like vengeance, you know, the desire for vengeance. And so kind of like kicking out the legs that hold a society where people don't seek vengeance up is unwise if you really don't understand even the concept of vengeance. I think there's a very superficial understanding of it. And this movie deals with it in a much more complex way, which is perhaps why people don't seem to understand that side of the movie. You know, that all the criticism that I read, no one really deals with that.
I think that you're correct about a lot of that, but there may be a distinction between revenge and vengeance. And I think that what you're talking about, and this goes into Nietzsche's idea of ressentiment and all this kind of stuff. And it also goes into his criticism of Christianity, because he said, and again, remember this idea from Christianity, which is, and from the quoting, do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. See, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him a drink. For in doing so, you will heap coals of fire on his head. I want to read that one more time. This is the Christian idea of how to deal with your enemies, okay? And you think it's just all nice and bright, right? If your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him a drink. For in doing so, you will heap coals of fire on his head. This is what Nietzsche didn't like about Christianity. He said, "What you're being nice to someone in a fake way just to make them feel it's really like
passive aggressive.
The ultimate of passive aggression behavior. It's kill them with kindness. It's not only that. It's like you're going to heap coals of fire on their head by being nice to them.
It's very contradictory. It's a very contradictory thing for a human to try to embody. You know, this idea that I'm going to take care.
It's a religion for lower classes. That's what it is. That's what it was originally. Christianity was a religion for slaves and the lower classes of Roman Empire. That's where it spread. So of course, if you don't have any power, what you do, that's your only means to change the power dynamic, which Nietzsche says they actually did and succeeded in doing very well. But this gets very controversial because this goes into his whole different types of morality and all that. Not important for this episode, but that's why he saw Christianity as anti-aristocratic and anti-excellence in a lot of ways.
Yeah, it upholds the meek, essentially.
But putting that aside, now I'm saying there's some benefits to it, to people who maybe aren't like the Northman, who's going to be able to go through and and take vengeance himself with a sword and all that kind of stuff, right? Like, it does have a kind of, like it or not, calming principle to a degree that keeps people from violence. But my thing is now, so now you're going to move into the secular world where you don't have that, but you just kind of have this kind of wishy-washy, but still you shouldn't be mean. And I'm afraid, my concern is that these people aren't, I'm concerned that there is a day coming where we may live in a kind of twisted perversion of the old pagan ways that's not good for anybody. It's not good for any, and it's not even Christian. This was a central point I was trying to get to about the whole episode.
So here's what I see, right? Vengeance, revenge, more specifically, seems to me to be a central component of a lot of leftist ideology, like particularly the more like radical Marxist ideology. There's this idea of, eat the rich even. And this idea of subverting the hierarchy and workers taking their due. It's this very it's almost like it is the secular political answer to dealing with vengeance. And it doesn't work,
revenge.
Obviously. Yeah, revenge.
Sorry, briefly,
well, vengeance is the idea that you're responding to a harm that was done to you.
I would make a distinction that vengeance requires someone of equal or better standing to take vengeance upon another, and that it becomes more revenge when you're somebody in this idea of the Marxist idea or the communist idea. If you're a lowly proletariat worker or something, it's more revenge than vengeance, because if you think about this early pagan idea, vengeance is only taken up by the man in the movie is a king. Do you understand? Or a prince, rather.
Well, isn't eat the rich? It is a lower person to a higher person. Are you saying they have to be same status, or?
In my conception of vengeance, it's vengeance is across same status for the most part.
I see what you mean.
Or somewhere around there. It makes more sense, because then it makes more sense with that payment of actual. Do you see how it's transactional?
Yeah, absolutely. And it kind of harkens to this honor culture also, which is estranged from our culture.
I'm sorry, I have a lot to say about this episode and this concept, but again, see, that's necessary because, and you hit upon this perfectly, which is that we live in a land of law now, and courts and judges, and there's a lot to be said for that people take for granted. If you lived in Norway in the 800s, you didn't have as many opportunities to go to the local magistrate to hear your case. Power was how things worked. And what I find interesting, coming myself from a rural environment, not so much in my lifetime, but in the lifetimes of the people that not too far back in my family tree, when it was really foresty out there, that was still the case. Like, things weren't settled by the police. Mm-hmm. You settled it by yourself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And
it's a very non-urban way of living that I think there's something about this that is not city-centered, because there's no means to take your case to an authority a lot of times.
Yeah, and this is also like self-rule, which seems to me something that naturally stems from cultures and populations where there's a lot of isolation and there's a lot of space between people. You can't just be like, I saw so-and-so breaking into so-and-so's house. There's a lot of this space. And so it becomes necessary for that kind of a community or population to know that each other has that capacity for, vengeance or righting wrongs. Then you're not depending on some outsider or some small police station. You know what I mean? It kind of keeps people in check if they know that if I mess with that person, that gives them the right to then come back after me. This is a kind of very, obvious concept I think, of course, that becomes chaotic in an urban environment where you have people all on top of each other, and you can have people that misinterpret grievances, right? You could have like someone hits your car and it's like, I'm going to take vengeance. It's like, no, it was an accident. You know, like you have too many people on top of each other. Too many things can go wrong accidentally. That's a situation where a third party, the courts, would make perfect sense.
But it's also the logic, even in urban areas, to a degree. It's the logic of the mafia. It's the logic of gangs.
That's true.
It's the logic of anyone that's outside the law. See, those people can't go to a judge to adjudicate a drug deal matter. If someone fucks you over, you can't take it to the court system to get it fixed. So of course it goes to violence. So it happens even in the cities, where if you're outside the law somehow, this always ends up being the way it is. So now, and it's unfortunate, this is an episode I actually had quite a few things to say, because now if we can think in the future, maybe we'll just have to save it for another episode. Because one could imagine, as a futurist, a society that's more and more rules-based will make more and more people outside of the law to some degree, simply by the proliferation of more and more rules and regulations.
Yeah, you're just naturally going to go astray of them eventually.
Right. And this is what a lot of people say, like, there's so many laws, everyone walks
You've
around
already broken
basically
a law,
being
yeah.
a criminal in some way, right? Like if everything was enforced. But imagine that continuing. Then what happens when the mass amount of people can't even deal with the system anymore because they're in violation of it? Speculation. I will now bound up my locks and bid our listeners and viewers goodbye. You can take us out.
Well, that's too bad, because there was a lot that we could have taken up in this episode that we didn't totally get to, because I know you had a point about like mass shooters enacting their own kind of weird revenge outside the law kind of thing. And that's somewhat what I was trying to touch on also, with this idea of feeling aggrieved by society, but not having enough reason to not take, revenge against society. And so this idea of what vengeance looks like in a post-Christian society, it's more important than we can fit into a 30-minute episode or so, because I don't think anyone's dealing with these ideas, because they're so old, this concept of vengeance, that I think we just forget it matters to humans, and that it's something that becomes very evident as soon as the structures that had kept it at bay and dealt with it fade away. And so this is the end of our episode on vengeance. Let us know in the comments what you think the role of vengeance in society is and will be. I would like to know what people think about that. And like, subscribe, etc. And we'll see you on the next episode of the Silver Eye Society.
So as a postscript, just like to say briefly, if there's anyone who is hiring extras for your Viking feature film, including Robert Eggers, give me a call.